purpose, or that he had done so without realizing. She eyed herself in the mirror again and lowered her chin a trifle.
Hey, OG, how you doing, bro?
Poise itself. He studied them with those bloodshot eyes, but saw nothing, apparently. Was that all Brigitte told you? He asked. And Nynaeve snapped back, That was quite enough, I think, even for you. Inexplicably, he looked surprised and quite pleased. Nynaeve gave a start, then folded her arms around herself tighter. Since you're in no condition to go anywhere with us now, don't scowl at me, Matt Cawthon. That isn't demeaning, it's simple truth. You can spend the morning moving yourself into the palace. And you needn't think
not
help
too
carry
bad.
your things. I didn't promise to be a pack horse. The wandering woman is plenty good enough, he began angrily, then stopped, a wondering expression spreading over his face.
How you doing today or this evening?
That should teach him to growl when he had a head like a melon. At least that was what hers had felt like the time she drank too much. Of course he would not learn from it. Men kept sticking their hands in the fire, thinking this time it would not burn, so Leni always said. You can hardly expect we'll find the bull the first time we try, Nynaeve went on. ta'veren or no. Going out each day will be much simpler if you don't have to come across the square. If they did not have to wait.
Oh shit, you watching my other one?
What she meant. According to her,
that was just
was not the only excuse
rolling one up
lying in bed till all hours,
and getting little stuff ready.
Besides, Elaine added, that way you can keep an eye on us. Nynaeve made a sound in her throat, very close to a groan. Did she not see that he must be enticed? It was not as if she had promised to actually allow him to keep an eye on them. He seemed not to have heard her or Nynaeve. Haggard eyes stared right through her. Why did they bloody well have to stop now? He moaned, so softly she
keep
barely
it in
heard. What
hard
case do you mean by that?
Just
because the rooms are fit for a king.
It's not mine. It's
Matt.
most hated.
Talon herself chose
I don't want to break
just
it.
Down from her own. She has taken a very personal interest. Matt, you wouldn't have us offend the queen, would you? One look at his face, and Elaine hurriedly channeled to push open the window and empty the wash basin through it. If she'd ever seen a man about to lose the contents of his stomach, he was staring red-eyed at her right that minute. I don't see why you're making such a fuss, she said. Actually, she supposed she did. Some of the serving women here probably let him paw them, but she doubted many in the palace would, if any. He would not be able to drink and gamble his nights away either. Talon surely would not allow a bad example for Vesland.
It's more that
We
they
all
sell
must make sacrifices.
at shops.
With
They
an
sell
effort
more
to
and more
stop
of
her, not telling
cases
him
like
that
this
his was
because they're
small and only right.
waterproof
They're
and
monstrous
shock
and
resistant.
unjust, no matter what
Because this one's
said.
most hated. He's got
Nynaeve had certainly railed against
he's got
any
another
sacrifice.
one that's a little bit
He
bigger.
put his head
We
in his
hold
hands again, making
a
strangled
dabber again.
noises while his shoulders shook. He was laughing. She hefted the basin.
Give me
on a
1
flow of
second.
air,
I gotta go grab something
considering
from
hitting him.
in the living room real quick.
When he raised his eyes again, though, he looked outraged for some reason. Sacrifices, he snarled. If I asked you to make the same, you'd box every ear in sight and pull the roof down on my head. Could he still be drunk? She decided to ignore his frightful glare. Speaking of your head, if you would like healing, I'm sure Nynaeve would oblige. If she had ever been angry enough to channel, she was now. Nynaeve gave a small jerk and glanced at her from the corner of one eye. Of course, she said hurriedly. If you want. The color in her cheeks confirmed all of Elaine's suspicions about that morning. Gracious as ever, he sneered. You just forget my head. I do very well without eyes, said I. And then, just to confuse matters, she was sure, he added in a hesitant voice, I thank you for asking, though. Almost as if he meant it. Elaine managed not to gape. Her knowledge of men was limited to Rand and what Leni and her mother had told her. Was Rand going to be as confusing as Matt Cawthon? Last thing before going, she remembered to secure a promise that he would start moving to the palace immediately. He kept his word once given, so Nynaeve had made clear, however reluctantly, but leave one crack, and he could find 100 ways to slip through. That she'd been all too eager to emphasize. He gave his promise with a bleak, resentful grimace, or maybe that was just his eyes again. When she set the basin down at his feet, he actually looked grateful. She would not feel sympathy. She would not. Once back in the corridor with the door to Matt's room closed, Nynaeve shook her fist at the ceiling. That man could try the patience of a stone. I'm glad he wants to cuddle with his head. Do you hear me? Glad. He will make trouble. He will. You two will make more trouble for him than he ever could. The speaker stalked down the hall toward them, a woman with a touch of gray in her hair, a strong face, and a commanding voice. She also wore a frown little short of a scowl. Despite the marriage knife hanging into her cleavage, she was too fair for an Ebudari. I couldn't believe it when Kyra told me. I doubt I've ever seen so much foolishness poured into just 2 dresses. Elaine eyed the woman up and down. Not even as a novice had she gotten used to being addressed in that tone. And who might you be, my good woman? I might be and am Satala Anam, the owner of this inn, child, was the dry reply. And with that, the woman flung open a door across the hallway, seized them each by an arm, and hustled them through so fast Elaine thought her slippers had left the floor. You seem under some misapprehension, Mistress Annan, she said coolly as the woman released them to shut the door. Nynaeve was in no mood for niceties. Holding her hand so her great serpent ring was plain, she said heatedly, Now you look here. Very pretty, the woman said, and pushed each of them so hard they found themselves sitting side by side on the bed. Elaine's eyes popped in disbelief. This Annan woman confronted them, grim-faced, fists on her hips, for all the world like a mother about to castigate her daughters. Flaunting that just shows how silly you are. That young man will dandle you on his knee, 1 on each, I shouldn't wonder, if you allow. He'll take a few kisses, and as much else as you're willing to give, but he won't harm you. You can harm him, though, if you keep on with this. Harm him? The woman thought she thought he had dandled. She thought... Elaine did not know whether to laugh or cry, but she stood up, straightening her skirts. As I said, Mistress Annan, you are under a misapprehension. Her voice became smoother as she went on, confusion giving way to calm. I'm Elaine Trakan, daughter Erebandor and Aes Sedai the Green Adra. I don't know what you think. Her eyes nearly crossed as Mistress Annan pushed a finger to the tip of her nose. Elaine, if that is your name, all that keeps me from dragging you down to the kitchen and washing your mouth out, yours and that other foolish girl's there, is the possibility that you actually can channel someone. Or are you silly enough to wear that ring when you can't even do that? I warn you it will make no difference to the sisters over in the Tarasin Palace. Do you even know about them? If you do, frankly, you are not foolish, you're blind stupid. Elaine's temper grew by the word. Foolish girl. Blind, stupid. She was not put up with it. Especially not right after being forced to crawl to Matt Coffin. Dandle? Matt Coffin? She maintained her outward composure, though, but not so Nynaeve. She glared in a fury, and the glow of Saidar enveloped her as she bounded to her feet. Flows of air wrapped Mistress Annan from shoulders to ankles, crushing her skirts and petticoats against her legs, just short of tight enough to topple her. I happen to be one of those sisters in the palace, Nynaeve Almira of the Yellow Ajah to be exact. Now, would you like me to carry you down to the kitchen? I know something about a mouth. Stepped away from the outstretched arm. The woman had to feel the pressure of the flows, and even a half-wit would have known what those invisible bonds must be. Yet she did not blink. Her green-flecked eyes narrowed. Channel, at least. Calmly. I should let you drag me downstairs, child. do to me, you would be in the hands of real Aes Sedai by noon, I'll wager that. Didn't you hear me? Nynaeve demanded. The Anan woman did not even pause. You'll not only spend the next year blubbering, you will do part of it in front of anyone you told that you were Aes Sedai. Be sure they'll make you happy. They will turn your liver to water. I should let you go blundering on your way, or else run across the palace as soon as you loose me. The only reason I don't is that they'll make an example of me nearly as much as of you, if they even suspect he's helped you. And as I said, I like the young man. I'm telling you, Nynaeve tried again, but still the innkeeper gave her no chance to tell anything. Tied like a bundle, the woman was a boulder rolling down. She was the whole hillside falling, flattening whatever lay in its path. Trying to keep up the lie does no good, Nynaeve. You look to be, 21, give or take a year, so you might be as much as 10 years older if you've already reached the slowing. You might even have worn the shawl 4 or 5 years, except for one thing. Her head, where she could move, swiveled to the side. You, child, aren't old enough to have slowed yet, and no woman has ever worn the shawl as young as you. Never in the history of the tower. If you ever were in the tower, I'll wager you wore white and squeaked every time the mistress of novices glanced your way. You had some goldsmith make that ring for you. There are some, fool enough, I hear. Or maybe Nynaeve stole it for you if she has any right to hers. Either way, since you can't be a sister, she. No, I didn't travel with a woman who was pretending. Elaine frowned, not noticing that she was chewing her lower lip. Slowing. How did an innkeeper in Ebu Dar know those words? Maybe Satala Anan had gone to the tower as
Hey,
well,
just chilling. How you doing, bro?
Since she clearly could not channel. Elaine would have known even if her ability had been as small as her own mother's, and Morghese Trakand had had an ability so small she would have been sent away in a matter of weeks, probably, had she not
Since
been
you're here, let's
on
do
the air.
another dab.
Release her, Nynaeve, she said, smiling. She truly did feel more welcome toward the woman now. It must have been terrible to make that journey to Tar Valon, only to be turned away. There was no reason the woman had to believe them. Something tickled at that, but she could not say what.
Oh, not much.
No reason at all.
Chilling,
if she had made the trip to
listening
Tar Valon,
to a book, and
maybe she would walk
doing a little smoking before I go to bed.
Marillilla or any of the other sisters could set her straight. Release her? Nynaeve yelled. Elaine! Release her. Mistress Anan, I see the only way to convince you is the Amerlin seat and 3 sitters couldn't convince me, child. Did she ever let anyone finish a sentence? Now, I don't have time for any more games. I can help the pair of you. I know those who can anyway, some women who've taken strays. You can thank Lord Matt that I'm willing to take you to them, but I must know. Were you ever in the tower, or are you Wilders? If you were there, were you put out, or did you run away? The truth. They handle each in a different way. Elaine shrugged. They had done what they came for. She was more than ready to stop wasting time and get on with what needed doing next. If you won't be convinced, then that's all there is to it. Nynaeve, it is past time. The flows around the innkeeper vanished, and the glow around Nynaeve, too. But Nynaeve stood there watching the woman warily, hopefully. She wet her lips. You know a group of women who can help us? Nynaeve, Elaine. We don't need her. We are Aes Sedai, remember? With a wry glance in her direction, Mistress Anan gave her skirts a shake to straighten them, and bent to smooth her exposed petticoats. Her real attention was on Nynaeve. Elaine had never felt so completely shunted aside in her life. I know a few women who take in the occasional Wilder or a woman who failed her test for or fall. There must be 50 of them altogether, though the number changes. They can help you find a life without the risk of a real sister making you wish she'd just skin you and be done. Now don't lie to me. Were you ever in the tower? If you've run away, you might as well decide to go back. The tower managed to find most runaways, even during the War of the 100 Years. So you needn't think this little bother now will stop them. In truth, my suggestion then would be to go across the square and throw
Oh
yourself
shit,
on
no.
your sister's mercy. It was mercy, I'm afraid. It's more than you'll find.
Oh yeah, I have a channel.
You won't even think of so much as
I usually
the tower
do
grounds without permission.
these late night ones like this, where I have my book playing. I sit here and smoke and chill out with everyone before I go to bed. So,
Nynaeve, what are you saying? Mistress Anana,
I did that anyways before I started doing a live of it. So
let me talk with Nynaeve,
I figured I'd
at least seems
try my luck and doing a live with me doing my normal thing and see how it do. And it's done pretty well.
They can too. And they'll
I do
bottom or toss you out
gaming
the street on
streams
your
too.
nose if you play the fool. Who is this Circle, Elaine?
But it's mainly
We are Aes Sedai. You
like
come across to the Tower
RPGs,
Palace and you will see.
fighting games like UFC,
Had the gall to say,
WWE,
all the while frowning and grimacing at Elaine, as if she were the one who had gone
Mortal
mad.
Kombat when I have it,
The
or the
Anon
RPGs
woman
like
nodded.
Skyrim,
Good. Now take
all
off
the
those rings
Diablos,
and put them away. The Circle doesn't allow
Assassin's
that sort of
Creed, and
They'll
stuff
have
like
them
that.
melted down to give you a start. Though by the look of your dresses, you have coin.
Oh yeah.
You stole it. Don't let Rhiannon know. One of the first.
I
rules you
like
have to
if I
know
had the
is don't
books
steal,
too.
even if
I've been
you
reading
started.
too, but
They don't want to draw attention.
the audiobook
Elaine made
is something I could
fists
put
and
on
placed it behind her back,
a timer
and watched
lay down and
meekly slip her ring off and tuck
relax,
it into
listen to
her
a
belt
book,
pouch.
and hopefully drift
Nynaeve
off.
howled every time Marililla or Adelius
Hey,
or any of
Netflash.
them forgot she was a full sister.
Or I'll have it
Trust me,
playing and
Nynaeve said.
while I'm playing a
Which
game.
Elaine would have had an easier time of if
Yeah.
she had any notion what.
Because I have a
Still,
Audible
she didn't trust
account that I've had for
a small sacrifice.
a while
She
now
knew.
that I have
Aes
over
Sedai did
100
go grab
titles
their rings
or
when the need arose,
books on
and
it.
she had too while passing for a sister, but it was hers by right now. Removing that band of gold almost hurt physically. Talk to your friend,
I have
child,
to.
the Anon woman.
Oh, I have to get it on my Audible account.
Rihanna Corley.
That's not one of the ones I have.
Sulky pouting, and
And Audible, you got to buy the book,
come along,
or
come along. It's lucky for you I like them.
because every month that I pay my bill, I get one free credit that I can use towards buying any book,
Sulky pouting.
no matter the cost. It one credit allows me pretty much any book I want to be able to purchase it.
Chapter 23. Next door to a
But I have to see next month with my free credit about getting that one.
Ears, but she did not find the chance right away.
Because right now I've been playing the Wheel of Time series.
Her stony impatience undented by the wary look she cast at Matt's door. At the back of the inn, a set of unrailed stone steps led down into a large
Hopefully
kitchen full of
the
bacon
Godfather
smell.
book's not too
Where the
boring.
roundest woman Nynaeve had ever seen was wielding a large wooden spoon like a scepter, directing three others in sliding crusty brown loaves from the ovens and replacing them with rolls of pale dough. A large pot of the coarse white porridge that was breakfast hereabout bubbled gently on one of the white-tiled stoves. Enid, Mistress Anan addressed the round woman. I'm going out for a little while. I need to take these two children to someone who has time to mother them properly. Wiping broad, flowery hands on a piece of white toweling, Enid studied Nynaeve and Elaine disapprovingly. Everything about her was round. Her sweaty, olive-skinned face, her dark eyes, all of her. She seemed made of very large balls stuffed into a dress. The marriage knife she wore hanging outside her snowy apron sparkled with a full dozen stones.
No shit.
Is this the pair of barkers Kyra was chattering about, Mistress? Fancy bits for the
That'd be a
young
pretty
lord's
cool
taste, I'd have said. He likes them with a bit of wiggle.
You may have to see if they have that one on audio book or not.
The innkeeper shook her head in vexation. I told that girl to hold her tongue. I won't let that sort of rumor touch the wandering woman. Remind Kyra for me, Enid, and use your spoon to get her attention if need be. The gaze she turned on Nynaeve and Elaine was so disparaging that Nynaeve nearly gasped. Would anyone with half their wits believe these two were Aes Sedai? Spent all their coin on dresses to impress the man, and now they'd starve unless they smile for him. Aes Sedai. Giving Enid no chance to answer, she seized Nynaeve's ear with her right hand.
It's always good when it's all in one book.
And in 3 quick steps had them out into the stable yard. That was as long as Nynaeve's shock held. Then she pulled free, or tried to, because the woman let go at the same instant, and she stumbled half a dozen paces, glaring indignantly. She had not bargained for being dragged about. Elaine's chin rose, her blue eyes so cold Nynaeve would not have been surprised to see frost forming in her curls. Hands on her hips, Mistress Anan seemed not to notice. Or perhaps she simply did not care. I can hope no one in there believes Kyra after that, she said calmly. If I could have been sure you had the wits to keep your mouths shut, I'd have said...
Yeah, I read a lot too when I was locked up too, but
she was calm,
even before I was locked up, I was always
they
reading.
had troubled her morning. Now follow me and don't get lost.
I've read a hell of a lot more.
Anywhere near my inn again, or I'll send somebody to the palace to tell Marililla and Teslin. They are 2 of the real sisters.
To where,
and they'll probably rip you each down.
well, I read most of what was in the library where I was at. Then I was getting ILLs. That's what we're, at least in this state, certain ones you're allowed to get them. There were in their library loans.
The thought of Matt,
you put a list of like 2 or 3 books that you want, and then they'll send them lists out to the different like actual public libraries that actually are with that program. And if the libraries have it, they'll actually ship you that book from that library.
The stare became more meaningful, hard as that was to credit.
So I thought that was pretty cool. It helped me out on certain books that
truly grateful, Mr. Sanan.
The prison didn't have that I was able to get from an actual public library.
When this was done, Nynaeve decided she was going to drag the innkeeper to the palace if need be, and make the other
I was allowed a little bit like a book or 2 more than
was empty, save for a lone boy of 10
most people, just because I had a good track record with my books, and I was getting back to them, and
a barrow sat in front
the same condition that I got them, and
sounds like a huge
didn't never damage them, and always gave them back to them when I was supposed to. And
it was a man singing. Would they have to
I was doing it on a regular basis, so
even a short
I guess they did it just to
walking only
mainly just to have me with more books, so it was less time. It was more time in between them instead of less time in between finishing the book and giving them back to them. Because when I was locked up, I actually read one of the longer ones that I read was
a small gate at the
a Stephen King book. I read The Stand, the complete and uncut edition.
You children keep up.
And that thing was like,
the innkeeper told them,
I think it took me
you lose yourselves, and I vow I'll go to the palace
about
myself.
a week to read that one.
Nynaeve took a grip on her braid with both hands as she followed, to keep them from the Anan woman's throat. How she yearned for her first gray hairs. First the other Aes Sedai, then the sea folk. Right, she did not want to think about them. And now an innkeeper. No one took you seriously unless you had at least a little gray. Even an Aes Sedai's ageless face could not possibly do as well in her estimation.
Yeah, we used to do that, or
skirts out the dust, though their still kicked up little puffs that settled on the hems of their dresses.
Because at first, when they give us our toilet paper, our 2 rolls for the week, it used to come with this paper wrapped around it.
She had a way of slashing,
and we'd use that too, because that was real thin, like the Bible paper too. We're using that for rolling papers, and using the
Back in the palace,
trick with the shiny part of the oatmeal packs with the two AA batteries to light your wick, to be able to light your joint or your cigarette.
Simply follow him along the streets of the Rahad and see what happens, or take him into buildings that look likely, or let him choose. There must be 100 worthwhile uses for this morning, including deciding whether it's safe to go back to Egwene, ever, after that bargain the sea folk wrung out of us. We have to talk about that sooner or later. Ignoring it won't help. Instead, we are off on a walk of who knows what length, squinting into the sun the whole way, if we keep on as we are, to visit women who feed runaways from the tower. Myself, I don't have much interest in catching runaways this morning or any morning, but I'm sure you can explain it, so I will understand. I do so want to understand, Nynaeve. I would hate to think I'm going to kick you the length of the Mulhara for nothing. Nynaeve's eyebrows drooped down. Kick her? Elaine really was becoming violent, spending so much time with Aviendha. Someone ought to slap some sense into that pair.
Hell yeah, just chilling. You be safe on the road, bro.
She muttered. It would be soon, unfortunately.
Well, I'll probably still be on. I'm doing this, and I'm also have my PS5 going too.
Guilty sometimes using the term wilders. In the mouths of most Aes Sedai, it was an insult, but she intended to make them speak it as a badge of pride one day. And she called them the Circle. That doesn't sound like a few friends to me. It sounds organized. The alley meandered between high walls and the backs of buildings, many showing bare brick through the plaster, between palace gardens and shops where an open back door revealed silversmiths, or tailors, or wood carvers at work. Every so often, Mistress Anan looked over her shoulder to make sure they still followed. Nynaeve gave her smiles and nods she hoped would convey eagerness. Nynaeve, if 2 women who could channel made a society, the tower would fall on them like a pack of wolves. How would Mistress Anan know whether they can or not anyway? Women who can and aren't Aes Sedai do not go about making a show of themselves, you know. Not for very long, anyway. In any case, I can't see it makes a difference. Egwene might want to bring every woman who can channel into the tower somehow, but that is not what we are about here. The frosty patience in Elaine's voice tightened Nynaeve's hands on her blade. How could the woman be so dense? She bared her teeth again for Mistress Anan, and managed not to scowl at the innkeeper's back when her head turned forward once more. 50 women isn't 2, Nynaeve whispered fiercely. They could channel. They must be able to. Everything hinged on that. It's beyond reason that this circle can be in the same city with a storeroom packed full of Angreal and such without at least knowing of it. And if they do, she could not keep satisfaction from honeying her voice. We'll have found the bull without Master Matrim Cawthon. We can forget those absurd promises. They were not a bribe, Nynaeve, Elaine said absently. I will keep them, and so will you if you have any honor, and I know you do. She was spending entirely too much time with Aviendha. Nynaeve wished she knew why Elaine had begun thinking they all had to follow this preposterous Aiel jeep, whatever it was. Elaine bit her underlip, frowning. All that
how you doing, bro?
Vanished. She was herself again, apparently. Finally, she said, we would never have gone to the inn without Master Cawthon, so we'd never have met the remarkable Mistress Anan, or been taken to this circle. So if the circle does lead us to the bowl, we have to say he was the
holds my joints.
Matt Cawthon. His name boiled in her head.
Originally made to hold.
Nynaeve stumbled over her own feet
the
and
raw coals,
but the alley was hardly as smooth as a
how's your night going, bro?
Much less a palace floor. At times, Elaine in a taking was better than Elaine thinking clearly. Remarkable, she muttered. I'll remarkable her till her eyes cross. No one has ever told
that's a flavored paper.
Not even people who doubt it. Not even the sea folk. Most people would step wary if a 10-year-old said she was Aes Sedai.
There's some extra ones I had.
Most people don't really know what an Aes Sedai's face looks like, Nynaeve. I think she went to the tower once. She knows things she couldn't otherwise. Nynaeve snorted, glowering at the back of the woman striding ahead. Satella Anan might have been to the tower 10 times, 100, but she was going to acknowledge Nynaeve Almira as
I like how it has.
and apologize, and learn what it was like to be hauled about by her ear, too. Mistress Anand glanced back, and Nynaeve flashed her.
Let me get the other one, because I had the whole set at one time.
Elaine, if these women do,
I kept them because
we don't have to tell Matt how we.
They look like the.
That was not quite a question.
The carnival.
Elaine replied.
Like in old carnivals,
but I'll have to
where they had like the freak shows put up.
If she had not thought the Anand woman might abandon them on the spot, Nynaeve would have screamed. The wandering alley gave way to a street, and there was no talking then to amount to anything. The sun's thin rim glared blindingly above the rooftops ahead. Elaine shaded her eyes with one hand, very unconsciously. Nynaeve refused. It was not that bad. She barely had to squint at all, really.
Dirty.
A clear blue sky mocked her weather sense. That still told her a storm was right on top of the city. Even this early, a few brightly lacquered coaches were about in the winding street, and a double fistful of brighter sedan chairs, 2 or sometimes 4 barefoot ladies in green and red striped vests to each, trotting because they carried passengers.
There we go.
Hidden behind the grilled wooden screens. Carts and wagons rumbled.
I remember the Garbage Pail Kids.
And people began to fill the streets as shop doors opened.
Yeah, but the only 2 I had left right now is
hurrying on errands, and men with great rolled carpets balanced on their shoulders, tumblers and jugglers and musicians readying themselves at likely corners, and hawkers with their trays of pins or ribbons or shabby fruit. The open-sided fish and meat markets had long
because at the shop that me and my brother worked at, or helped out at, should I say,
most of the butchers too, except those dealing in beef.
Whatchamacallit,
dodging through the crowds,
we had these in, and then we had
it seemed to think they had no reason to slow. Mistress Anand set a fast pace.
Or hemp wraps. There were
plenty of those.
The same company, so I wish I would have saved those ones too, because they were it was a bigger graphic, should I say, because it was a blunt wrap, so you had that bigger picture on it.
But she always stopped to chat a moment with the innkeepers.
I also got.
After the first, Nynaeve wished fervently that she would not again. After the second, she prayed for it. After the third, she stared straight ahead and tried in vain not to hear. Elaine's face grew tighter and tighter, colder and colder. Her chin rose till it was a wonder she could see to walk. There was a reason, Nynaeve had to admit grudgingly. In Ebu Dar, someone wearing silk might stroll the length of a square.
This one just says
everybody else
sweet flavor,
wool or
but it's
seldom with much
skunk brand,
except for an occasional beggar who would acquire a cast-off silk garment, frayed on every edge and more whole than cloth. She just wished Mistress Anand had chosen some other explanation for why she was leading the pair of them through the streets. She wished she did not have to listen one more time to a tale of 2 flighty girls who had spent all their money on fine clothes to impress a man. Matt came out of it well, burn him. A fine young fellow, if Mistress Anand had not been married. A beautiful dancer with just a touch of the rogue. All of the women laughed. Not her or Elaine, though. Not the brainless little honey kissers. That was the word she used. Nynaeve could guess what it meant. Honey kissers, penniless from chasing after a man, and their purses full of brass bits and tin to fool fools. Witless loobies, who would have been reduced to beggary or theft, had Mistress Anand not known someone who might give them...
Well, my other container, should I say.
She doesn't have to stop at every inn in the city, Nynaeve growled as she stalked away from the stranded goops. 3 broad stories with an innkeeper who wore large garments, despite the humble name.
Case that
Mistress Anand hardly even
our friend
they followed now.
Ouija Buds made for me.
Realize we'll never be able to show our own faces in any of those places? I suspect that is exactly the point. Every word out of Elaine's mouth was chipped from ice. Nynaeve, if you sent us running after a wild pig, there was no need to complete the threat.
Hold up.
With Brigitta and
that's just one of my containers of papers.
Elaine could make her life miserable until she was satisfied. They will take us right to the bowl, she insisted, flapping her hands to shoo a beggar with a horrible purple scar that obliterated one eye. She could recognize flour paste dyed with blue wort when she saw it. I know they will. Elaine sniffed in an offensively expressive manner. Nynaeve lost count of the number of bridges they crossed, large and small, with barges poling beneath. The sun climbed its own height above the rooftops, then twice. The Anan woman did not follow even so straight a line as she might have. She really did seem to be going out of her way to find inns, but they continued generally
What's cool
east,
about this one
and
is
Nynaeve thought they must be nearing the river when the hazel-eyed woman suddenly rounded on them. You watch your tongues now. Speak when you're spoken to and not else. You embarrass me and... With a final frown and a mutter half under her breath that she was probably making a mistake, she jerked her head for them to follow again to a flat-roofed house right opposite. It was not a large house, 2 stories without one balcony, cracked plaster
but I thought
and
that
brick
was cool,
showing
the
in several
essence flavored
places,
one.
and hardly in an agreeable location, with the loud rattling of a weaver's
One
looms
sec, I
to
gotta
one
move
side,
this
and
just
the
a little
acrid
bit.
stinks of a dyer's shop to the other. A maid answered the door, though, a graying woman with a square jaw, shoulders like a blacksmith, and a steely eye unsoftened by the sweat on her face.
It's
As
my
Nynaeve followed Mistress Anan in, she smiled. Somewhere in that house,
other
a
stash
woman was
papers.
channeling. The square-jawed maid obviously knew Setala Anan on sight, but her reaction was odd. She curtsied with a very real respect, yet she was plainly surprised to see her and
Not
obviously
so much
doubtful
in this
about her
one.
being there. She almost fluttered
These
before
are
letting
some
them
old
in.
school papers.
Nynaeve and Elaine were greeted with no ambivalence, though. They were shown to a sitting room 1 flight up, and the maid told them firmly, "Don't stir a toe and don't touch anything, or you'll catch the old what for," then vanished. Nynaeve looked at Elaine. Nynaeve,
I don't remember which ones these ones are, but...
The field changed, swelling for a moment, then subsiding, lower than before. Even 2 women doesn't mean anything, Elaine protested, but she sounded doubtful.
Not to leave
That
those
was
ones
the most
out.
ill-mannered maid I've ever seen.
And
She took a tall-backed red chair, and after a moment, Nynaeve sat too, but she perched on the edge. From eagerness, not nerves. Not nerves at all. The room was not grand, but the blue and white floor tiles glistened, and the pale green walls looked freshly painted. No trace of gilt showed anywhere, of course, yet fine carving covered the red chairs arrayed along the walls, and several small tables of a darker blue than the tiles. The lamps hanging from sconces were clearly brass, polished till they shone. Carefully arranged evergreen branches filled the swept hearth, and the lintel above the fireplace was carved, not plain stone.
So I have
the
these
carving
ones.
seemed an odd choice, what people around Ebu Dar
And I
called
have,
13 sins. A
I
man
think I
with
might have
eyes
them
that
in
nearly filled his whole face
the
were
living
empty.
room in my
A fellow
little
with his tongue hanging
table.
to his ankles.
But I got
a snarling, sharp-toothed
the
man
old school
clutching
Randy's
coins
with
to his
its
chest for greed,
white
and so on.
regular paper.
But
Then
all in all,
I
it
got the
satisfied
king
her very
size
much.
Randy ones
Whoever could
too.
afford that room could afford fresh plaster outside, and the only reason not to put it up was to keep.
And that's just the papers I have. Most hated has
the door open, and
a bigger variety of papers than me. Of course, I do have. I have a whole
tone was tight
box
with
of
and anger. You know how careful we are, Setala.
raw
You know more than
king
you
size
should,
rolling
and
papers.
You surely know that. I'm very sorry, Rihanna, Mr. Sanan answered stiffly. I suppose I didn't think. I submit myself both to stand surety for these girls' behavior and to your judgment.
As far as I know.
Of course not. Rihanna's tone was high with shock.
No.
That is
mainly
to say,
because
I mean, you shouldn't have, but Setala, I apologize for raising my voice.
We had to take them.
You have.
Well, we had to take those and
Rihanna.
roach clips off our
reluctant at the same
inventory at the store.
I did wrong to bring them.
That we weren't allowed to sell no more because
I shouldn't have spoken to you so.
They were considered.
You must forgive me. Please.
The roach clips were considered paraphernalia.
The Anan woman and Rihanna Corley entered the sitting room, and Nynaeve blinked in surprise. From the exchange, she had expected someone
since
younger
Randy's
than
had the
but Rihanna had hair more gray than not, and a face full of what
they
might have been
considered the wire a
lines.
roach clip.
In worry now.
So
why would the older woman humble herself so to the younger?
Considered paraphernalia.
And why would the younger allow it? however
so we couldn't
half-heartedly.
sell them no more.
Customs were different here, the light knew. Some more different than she liked to think about. Yet not this much, surely. Of course, she'd never gone
But
very
that's
far
before.
toward being humble with the women's circle back home. But this, of
That's
course,
before it went
Rihanna
wreck.
could channel. She had expected.
I'm not sure if it's changed yet or not,
but she had not expected the strength.
I don't think it has.
Rihanna was not as strong as Elaine or even Nicole,
and
that wretched girl.
all the
But
shops
she
that
easily
we have,
Shiriam say, or
and we have
or Kiruna.
we
Not
have
many
quite
women possessed
quite
so
a few
much strength,
that's
and for all she herself bettered it
that's
by a
popped
fair
up
margin,
since it went
she
wreck,
was surprised to find
and
it.
that
The woman
so
must
far
be one of the
any
wildest.
of them
The tower would have found a way
I
to keep its
have
hand
I
on a
haven't
woman like
seen
this if they had
any
to hold
type
her
of
in the novice
Randys or
dress her whole life.
like
Nynaeve rose
hemostats
as
or
they
roach
came through the
clips.
doorway, smoothing her skirts. Not from nervousness, certainly not. Oh, but if only this came out.
But I had a lot more Randys, but I given some
Rihanna's
away.
sharp blue eyes studied the
Because
two
when
of
they
them
went,
with the air
we
of
weren't allowed to
someone
sell
who
no more. I
just
ended
found a pair
up
of pigs in her kitchen, fresh from the sty and dripping mud.
buying
She dabbed at her
a
face
box
with
of
a
it
tiny
from work.
handkerchief, though the interior of the house was cooler than outside.
We worked there, but we didn't get nothing for free.
I suppose we'll have to do
We
something
got
with them, she murmured.
We got a hell of a
If they are
discount,
what they
but
claim. Her voice was quite
there was
high
a hell of a
even now,
discount
musical and almost youthful.
the last of the
As
Randys
she
we
finished
had.
speaking, she gave a small start for some reason and eyed the innkeeper sideways, which set off another round of Mistress Anand's reluctant apologies and Mistress Corley's flustered attempts to deflect them. In Ebou Dar, when folk were truly being polite, apologies back and forth could flow for an hour. Elaine had risen too, wearing a slightly fixed smile.
But what's funny is
She
you can
raised
go
an eyebrow
online
at Nynaeve,
and
tucked
still
her
buy
elbow
them
in
and
one
order
hand
them.
and laid a finger
But yet
against her cheek.
they can't sell them in shops.
Nynaeve cleared her throat. Mistress Corley, my name is Nynaeve Almira, and this is Elaine Trakand. We are looking for... Satala has told me all about you, the blue-eyed woman cut in ominously. However many gray hairs on her head, Nynaeve suspected she was also hard as a stone fence. Abide with patience, girl, and I'll deal with you directly. She turned back to Satala, blotting her cheeks with the handkerchief. Barely suppressed diffidence once more tinged her voice. Satala, if you will please excuse me, I must question these girls and... Look who is returned after all these years, a short, stout woman in her middle years blurted as she barged into the room, nodding at her companion. Despite her red-belted Ebou Dari dress and a tanned face that glistened damply, her accents were pure Cairienan. Her equally sweaty companion, in the dark, plainly cut woolens of a merchant, was a head taller, no older than Nynaeve, with dark, tilted eyes, a strongly hooked nose, and a wide mouth. It's Garinia! The flow of words terminated abruptly in confusion as the stout woman realized others were present. Rihanna clasped her hands as if in prayer, or perhaps because she wanted to hit someone. Beroin, she said with an edge. One day you will run right off a cliff before you see it under your feet. I am sorry, Blushing, the Cairienan lowered her eyes. The Saldaean became intent on fiddling with a circle of red stones pinned at her breast. For Nynaeve's part, she gave Elaine a triumphant look. Both newcomers could channel, and Saidar was still being wielded somewhere in the house. Two more, and while Beroin was not very strong, Garinia stood even above Rihanna. She could match Lelaine or Ramonda. Not that that mattered, of course, yet this made at least 5. Elaine's chin set stubbornly, but then she sighed and gave a small nod. Sometimes it took the most incredible effort to convince her of anything. Your name is Garinia? Mistress Anand said slowly, frowning at the woman in question. You look very much like someone I met once. Zarya Alcaiza. Dark tilted eyes blinked in surprise. Plucking a lace-trimmed handkerchief from her sleeve, the Saldaean merchant touched her cheeks. That is my grandmother's sister's name, she said after a moment. I'm told I favor her strongly. Was she well when you saw her? She forgot her family completely after she went off to Kamai Sedai. Your grandmother's sister. The innkeeper laughed softly. Of course. She was well when I saw her, but that was a long time ago. I was younger than you are now. Rihanna had been hovering at her side, all but grabbing her elbow, and now she leaped in. Satala, I truly am sorry, but I really must ask you to excuse us. You will forgive me not showing you to the door? Mistress Anand made her own apologies, as if she was at fault because the other woman could not escort her down, and departed with a last, very dubious look at Nynaeve and Elaine. Satala, Garinia exclaimed as soon as the innkeeper was gone. That was Satala Anand? How did she... Light of heaven! Even after 70 years, the tower would... Garinia, Mistress Corley said in an extremely sharp tone. Her stare was sharper still, and the Saldaean's face reddened. Since you two are here, we can make up the 3 for questioning. You girls stay where you are and keep silent. That last was for Nynaeve and Elaine. The other women withdrew to a corner in a huddle and began conversing in soft murmurs. Elaine moved nearer Nynaeve. I did not like being treated as a novice when I was a novice. How long do you intend to continue this farce? Nynaeve hissed at her for quiet. I'm trying to listen, Elaine, she whispered. Using the power was out of the question, of course. The 3 would have known on the instant. Fortunately, they wove no barriers, perhaps not knowing how, and sometimes their voices rose just enough. Said they may be wilders, Rihanna said, and shock and revulsion bloomed on the other women's faces. Then we show them the door, Beroin said. The back door. Wilders. I still want to know who this Satala Anand is, Garinia put in. If you can't keep your mind on the straight, Rihanna told her, perhaps you should spend this turn on the farm. Alice knows how to concentrate a mind wonderfully. Now, the words dropped back to a buzz. Another maid appeared, a slender woman, pretty except for a sullen expression, with a rough gray woolen dress and a long white apron. Setting a green lacquered tray on one of the small tables, she surreptitiously wiped her cheeks with a corner of her apron and began fussing with blue-glazed cups and a matching teapot. Nynaeve's eyebrows rose. This woman could channel too, if not to any high degree. What was she doing as a servant? Garinia glanced over her shoulder and gave a start. What did Derris do to earn penance? I thought fish would sing the day she cracked a rule, much less broke one. Beroin sniffed loudly, but her reply was barely audible. She wanted to marry. She will advance a turn and go with Karila the day after the Feast of the Half-Moon. That will settle for Master Denal. Perhaps you both wish to hoe the fields for Alice? Rihanna spoke dryly, and the voices fell again. Nynaeve felt a rush of exultation. She did not care much for rules, at least for other people's rules. Other people rarely saw the situation as clearly as she, and thus made stupid rules. Why should that woman Derris not marry if she wished, for example? But rules and penances spoke of a society. She was right. And another thing. She nudged Elaine until the other woman bent her head. Beroin's wearing a red belt, she whispered. That indicated a wise woman, one of Ebu Dar's fabled healers, her care known far and wide as the next best to being healed by an Ais Sedai, curing just about anything. Supposedly it was all done with herbs and knowledge, but how many wise women have you seen, Elaine? How many could channel? How many were Ebu Dari, or even Antara? 7, counting Beroin, was the slow answer. And only one, I was sure, was from here. Ha! The others plainly had not been. Elaine took a deep breath, though she went on softly. None had anywhere near these women's strength, though. At least she had not suggested they were mistaken somehow. All of those wise women had been able. Nynaeve, are you really suggesting that the wise women, all the wise women, are... That would be beyond incredible. Elaine, this city has a guild for the men who sleep in squares every night. I think we've just found the ancient sisterhood of wise women. The stubborn woman shook her head. The Highlands had 100 sisters here years ago, 200. Anything of the sort would have been squashed flat in short order. Maybe the tower doesn't know, Nynaeve said. Maybe the guild keeps low enough that the tower never thought they were worth troubling. There's no law against channeling if you aren't Aes Sedai, only against claiming to be Aes Sedai or misusing the power, or bringing discredit. That meant doing anything that might possibly cast a bad light on real Aes Sedai should anyone happen to think you were one, which was going pretty far to her way of thinking. The real trouble, though, was that she did not believe it. The tower seemed to know everything, and they probably would break up a quilting circle if the women in it could channel. Yet there had to be some explanation for... Only half aware, she felt the true source being embraced, but suddenly she became very aware. Her mouth fell open as a flow of air snared her braid right at the base of her skull and ran her across the room on her toes. Elaine ran right beside her, red-faced with fury. The worst of it was they were both shielded. The short run ended when they were allowed to settle their heels in front of Mistress Corley and the other two, all three seated against the wall in red chairs, all surrounded by the glow of Saidar. "You were told to be quiet," Rihanna said firmly. "If we decide to help you, you will have to learn that we expect strict obedience no less than the White Tower itself." She imbued those last words with a tone of reverence. "I will tell you that you would have been treated more gently if you had not come to us in this irregular fashion." The flow gripping Nynaeve's braid vanished. Elaine tossed her head angrily as she was released. Appalled astonishment became fiery outrage as Nynaeve realized that Barrowyn held her shield. Most Aes Sedai she had met stood above Barrowyn, nearly all. Gathering herself, she strained to reach the source, expecting the weaves to shatter. She would at least show these women she would not be. The weaves stretched. The round Kyrianan woman smiled, and Nynaeve's face darkened. The shield stretched further, further, bulging like a ball. It would not break. That was impossible. Anyone could block her from the source if they caught her by surprise, of course, and someone weaker could hold the shield once woven, but not this much weaker. And a shield did not bend that far without breaking. It was impossible. "You could burst a blood vessel if you keep at that," Barrowyn said, almost companionably. "We do not try to reach above our station, but skills are honed with time, and this was always nearly a talent with me. I could hold one of the Forsaken." Scowling, Nynaeve gave over. She could wait. Since she had no choice, she could. Daris came bearing her tray, distributing cups of dark tea to the three seated women. She never so much as glanced at Nynaeve or Elaine before making a perfect curtsy and returning to her table. "We could have been drinking blueberry tea, Nynaeve," Elaine said, shooting such a look at her that she came close to stepping back. "Maybe it would be best not to wait too long." "Be quiet, girl." Mistress Corley's tone might be calm, but she patted her handkerchief to her face angrily. "Our report of you says you both are froward and contentious, that you chase after men and lie, to which I add that you cannot follow simple instructions, all of which must change if you seek our help. All of it. This is most irregular. I'm grateful we're willing to stick to you." "We can seek your help," Nynaeve said. She wished Elaine was saying so. It was worse than the woman's hard stare. Well, as bad, anyway. "We desperately need to find a ter'angreal." Rihanna Corley broke in as if she'd been standing there silent. "Usually we know the girls brought to us beforehand, but we must make certain you are what you say. How many doors to the tower and library may a novice use, and which?" She took a sip of tea, waiting. "2." The word dripped from Elaine's mouth. "The main door to the east when a sister sends her, or the small door at the southwest corner called the novice door, where she goes for herself. How long, Nynaeve?" Garinia, who held Elaine's shield, channeled another slender flow of air, not gently. Elaine quivered again, and Nynaeve winced, wondering that she did not grab at the back of her skirt. A civil tongue is another requirement, Garinia murmured. That is Mistress Corley said, as if nothing else had happened, although she did eye the Saldaean woman briefly over her tea. Now, how many bridges in the water garden? 3, Nynaeve snapped, mainly because she knew. She had not known about the library, having never been a novice. We need to know. Berwin could not spare anything to channel a flow of air, but Mistress Corley could, and did. Barely keeping her face smooth, Nynaeve knotted her hands in her skirts to hold them still. Elaine had the gall to give her a small, chilly smile. Chilly, but satisfied. A dozen more questions from how many floors the novice quarters contained, 12, to under what circumstances a novice was allowed into the hall of the tower. To carry messages, or to be expelled from the tower for a crime, no others. Hammered without Nynaeve getting in more than 2 words, and those 2 answered silently by the horrible Corley woman. She began to feel like a novice in the hall. They were not allowed to speak a word either. That was one of the few answers she knew, but luckily Elaine responded promptly when she did not. Nynaeve might have done better had they asked about accepted. A little better at least, but it was what a novice should know that interested them. She was just glad Elaine was willing to go along, though by her pale cheeks and raised chin, that could not last much longer. I suppose Nynaeve was really there, Rihanna said finally, exchanging glances with the other 2. If Elaine taught her to pass, I think she would have done a better job. Some people live in perpetual fog. Berwin sniffed, then nodded slowly. Berwin's nod came entirely too promptly for Nynaeve's liking. Please, she said politely. She could be polite when there was reason, whatever anyone said. We truly need to find the ter'angreal the sea folk call the Bowl of the Winds. It's in a dusty old storeroom somewhere in the Rahad, and I think your guild, your circle, must know where. Please help us. 3 suddenly stony faces stared at her. There is no guild, Mistress Corley said coolly. Only a few friends who found no place in the White Tower. Again that reverential tone. And who are foolish enough occasionally to reach out a hand where it's needed. We have no truck in ter'angreal or angreal or sa'angreal either. We are not Aes Sedai. Aes Sedai echoed with veneration as well. In any case, you are not here to ask questions. We have more for you, to see how far you've gone, after which you will be taken to the country and given into the care of a friend. She will keep you until we decide what to do next, until we can be sure the sisters are not looking for you. You have a new life ahead of you, a new chance, if you can only let yourselves see it. Whatever held you back in the tower does not apply here, whether a lack of dexterity or fear or anything else. No one will push you to learn or do what you cannot. What you are is sufficient. Now, enough, Elaine said in a wintry voice. Long enough, Nynaeve. Or do you intend to wait in the country for however long? They do not have it, Nynaeve. Removing her great serpent ring from her belt pouch, she thrust the circle of gold onto her finger. From the way she looked at the seated women, no one would believe her shielded. She was a queen out of patience. She was Aes Sedai to her hair was what she was. I am Elaine Trakand, high seat of House Trakand. I am daughter heir of Andor and Aes Sedai of the Green Aja, and I demand you release me immediately. Nynaeve groaned. Garinia grimaced with disgust, and Berwin's eyes widened in horror. Rihanna Corley shook her head ruefully, but when she spoke, her voice was iron. I had hoped Satala had changed your mind concerning that particular lie. I know how hard it is to set out proudly for the White Tower, then find yourself faced with returning home to admit failure. But that is never said, even in joke. I made no joke, Elaine said lightly. Snow was light. Garinia leaned forward with a scowl, a flow of air already forming until Mistress Corley raised her hand. And you, Nynaeve? Do you persist in this madness too? Nynaeve filled her lungs. These women had to know where the bowl was. They just had to. Nynaeve, Elaine said peevishly. She was not going to let her forget this, even if they did have to effect an escape. She had a way of harping on every little misstep in a manner that cut the ground right from under your feet. I'm an Aes Sedai of the Yellow Ajah, Nynaeve said wearily. The true Amyrlin seat, Egwene Alvear, raised us to the shawl in Salidar. She's no older than Elaine, you must have heard. Not a glimmer of change in those 3 hard faces. She sent us to find the Bowl of the Winds. With it we can mend the weather. Not a flicker of change. She tried to hold her anger down. She truly did. It just oozed up despite her. You must want that. Look around you. The Dark One is strangling the world. If you have even a hint of where the bowl might be, tell us. Mistress Corley motioned for Derris, who came and took the cups, casting fearful, wide-eyed looks at Nynaeve and Elaine. When she scurried away, out of the room in fact, the 3 women stood slowly, standing like grim magistrates pronouncing sentence. I regret that you will not accept our help, Mistress Corley said coldly. I regret this whole affair. Reaching into her pouch, she pressed 3 silver marks into Nynaeve's hand, and another 3 into Elaine's. These will take you a little way. You can also get something for those dresses, I should think, if not what you paid. Those are hardly suitable garments for a journey. By tomorrow sunrise, you will be gone from Ebou Dar. We aren't going anywhere, Nynaeve told her. Please, if you know... She might as well have kept silent. The measured flow of words did not slow.
So I'm a little distracted.
At that time, we will begin circulating your descriptions, and we will make certain they reach the sisters in the Tarasin Palace. If you are seen after sunrise, we will see that the sisters know where you are, and the White Cloaks as well. Your choice then will be to run, surrender to the sisters, or die. Go, do not return, and you should live long if you give over this repulsive and dangerous ruse. We are done with you. Barrowen, see to them, please. Brushing between them, she went from the room without looking back. Sullenly, Nynaeve let herself be herded down to the front door. A struggle would not achieve anything except maybe being thrown out bodily, but she did not like giving up. Light she did not. Elaine marched, frozen determination to leave and be done shining in every line of her. In the small entry hall, Nynaeve decided to try once more. Please, Garenia, Barrowen, if you have any hint, tell us. Any clue at all. You must see how important this is. You must. The blindest are those who keep their eyes shut, Elaine quoted, not quite under her breath. Barrowen hesitated, but not Garenia. She put her face right in Nynaeve's. Do you think we're fools, girl? I'll tell you this. If I had my way, we would bundle you out to the farm no matter what you say. A few months of Elise's attentions, and you'd learn to guard your tongue and be grateful for the help you spit on. Nynaeve considered hitting her on the nose. She did not need Saidar to use her fist. Garenia, Barrowen said sharply, apologize. We do not hold anyone against her will, and you know it well. Apologize immediately. And wonder of wonders, the woman who would have stood very close to the top had she been Aes Sedai looked sideways at the woman who would have stood near the bottom and blushed crimson. I ask forgiveness, Garenia mumbled at Nynaeve. My temper gets the better of me sometimes, and I say what I have no right to. I humbly ask forgiveness. Another sidelong glance at Barrowen, who nodded, producing a sigh of open relief. While Nynaeve was still gaping, the shields were released, and she and Elaine were pushed into the street, the door slamming shut behind them. Chapter 24. The Kin. Incredible, Rihanna thought, watching from a window as the 2 strange girls vanished down the street among the tradesmen and beggars and occasional sedan chairs. She'd returned to the meeting room as soon as the pair was escorted from it. She did not know what to make of them, and their persistent claims in the face of all reason were only part of her confusion. They did not perspire. Barrowin whispered at her shoulder. Yes? She would have arranged for the news to reach the Tarasin Palace in the next hour if she had not given her word, and if not for the danger. Fear bubbled in her middle, the same panic that had overtaken her after one passage through the silver arches when she went to test for Accepted. Just as she had every time it had stirred in the years since, she took a fresh grip on herself. In truth, she did not realize that the fear she might run screaming again had long since conquered any possibility that she would. She prayed that those girls would abandon their insanity. She prayed that if they did not, they were caught far from Ebu Dar and either kept silent or were not believed. Precautions would have to be taken, safeguards carried out that had not been used in years. Aes Sedai were as near omnipotent as made no difference, though. That she knew in her bones. Eldest, could it be possible that the older of the two really is? We channeled and... Barrowin trailed off miserably, but Rihanna did not need to consider, not even setting aside the younger girl. Why would any Aes Sedai pretend to be less? So much less. Besides, any real Aes Sedai would have put them all on their knees begging mercy, not stood there so submissively. We did not channel in front of an Aes Sedai, she said firmly. We broke no rule. Those rules applied to her as strictly as anyone else. The very first was that they were all one, even those set above for a time. How could it have been otherwise when those who were above must eventually step down? Only through movement and change could they remain hidden. But some of the rumors do mention a girl as Amyrlin, eldest, and she knew... Rebels! Rihanna put into that all the outraged disbelief she felt, that anyone should dare to rebel against the White Tower. It was hardly strange for unbelievable tales to attach to anyone like that. What about Loghain and the Red Ajah? Garinia demanded, and Rihanna fixed her with a stare. The woman had gotten herself another cup of tea before coming back up, and she managed to sip defiantly. Whatever the truth, Garinia, it is not our place to criticize anything Aes Sedai might do. Rihanna's mouth tightened. That hardly squared with what she felt toward the rebels, but how could any Aes Sedai do such a thing? The Saldean bent her neck in acquiescence, though, and perhaps to hide the sullen twist of her mouth. Rihanna sighed. She herself had given up dreams of the Green Ajah long, long ago, but there were those like Barrowin who believed, secretly they thought, that somehow they might one day return to the White Tower, somehow yet become Aes Sedai. And then there were women like Garinia, almost as poor at keeping their wishes secret, though those wishes were 10 times as forbidden. They actually would have accepted Wilders, and even gone out to find girls who could be taught. Garinia was not done. She always skirted the edges of discipline and frequently stepped over. What of this Setala Anan, then? Those girls know about the circle. The Anan woman must have told them, though how she knows. She shuddered, in a way that would have been entirely too ostentatious for most others, but she had never been able to conceal her emotions, even when she should. Whoever betrayed us to her must be found, and her betrayal punished too. She's an innkeeper, and she must be taught to guard her tongue. Barrowin gasped, wide-eyed with shock, and dropped into a chair so hard she bounced. Remember who she is, Garinia, Rihanna said sharply. If Setala had betrayed us, we would be crawling to Tar Valon, begging forgiveness the whole way. When she first came to Ebu Dar, she'd been told the story of a woman made to crawl to the White Tower, and nothing she had seen since of Aes Sedai made her question it in the least. She has kept the few secrets she knows from gratitude, and I doubt that has faded. She would have died in her first childbirth if the kin had not helped her. What she knows comes from careless tongues, when it was thought she could not hear, and the owners of those tongues were punished more than 20 years ago. Still, she wished there was some way she could bring herself to ask Setala to be more circumspect. She must have spoken carelessly in front of those girls. The woman bowed her head again, but her mouth was set stubbornly. At least part of this turn, Rihanna decided, Garinia would spend at the retreat, and she would have special instructions to relay with her own stubborn mouth. Alice seldom required more than a week to make a woman decide stubbornness did not pay. Before she could inform Garinia, though, Darius was curtsying in the doorway, announcing Sarenya Vostovan. As usual, Sarenya swept right in before Rihanna could say to admit her. In some ways, the strikingly handsome woman made Garinia appear supple, despite keeping the form of every rule exactly. Rihanna was sure she would have worn her hair in braids and bells given the choice, and never mind how that would have looked with her red belt. But then, given the choice, she would not have served even one turn with the belt. Sarenya did curtsy at the door, of course, and kneeled before her, head lowered. But 50 years had not made her forget that she would have been a woman of considerable power had she been able to make herself return home to Arafel. Curtsy and the rest all were concessions. When she spoke in that husky, forceful voice, whether the woman would ever reconcile herself and the problem of Garinia left Rihanna's mind. Callie is dead, eldest sister. Her throat was cut and she apparently had been robbed even of her stockings, but Sumiko says that it was the One Power killed her. That is impossible, Beroin burst out. No kinswoman would do such a thing. An Aes Sedai? Garinia said, hesitant for once. But how? The 3 oaths. Sumiko must be wrong. Rihanna raised a hand for silence. Sumiko was never wrong, not in this area. She would have been Yellow Adja had she not broken down completely while testing for the shawl, and although it was forbidden, despite countless penances, she worked to learn more whenever she thought no one was watching. No Aes Sedai could have done this, obviously, and no kinswoman would have, but those girls, so insistent, knowing what they should not. The circle had lasted too long, offered succor to too many women to be destroyed now. This is what must be done, she told them. That flutter of fear began again, but for once she hardly noticed. Nynaeve stalked away from the small house in outrage. It was incredible. Those women did have a guild. She knew they did. Whatever they said, she was sure they knew where the bowl was, too. She would have done whatever was necessary to bring them to tell her. Pretending docility before them for a few hours would have been a deal easier than putting up with Matt Cawthon for the light knew how many days. I could have been as acquiescent as they wanted, she thought irritably. They'd have thought I was a pliable old slipper. I could have... That was a lie, and it did not take a foul, remembered taste to convince her. Given half a chance, she would have shaken every one of those women till they told her what she wanted to know. She would have given them Aes Sedai till they squealed. She scowled sideways at Elaine. The other woman seemed lost in thought. Nynaeve wished she did not know what the other woman was thinking about. A wasted morning, and not far short of complete humiliation. She did not like being in the wrong. She was not yet used to admitting she was, really. And now she was going to have to apologize to Elaine. She truly hated apologizing. Well, it would be bad enough back in their rooms. With Birgitta and Aviendha still out, it was to be hoped. She was not about to begin in the street, with who knew who streaming by. The throng had thickened, though the sun hardly seemed much higher through the wheeling clouds of seabirds that cried overhead. Finding their way was not easy, after all those twists and turns.
You're all stuck.
Nynaeve had to ask directions half a dozen times, while Elaine stared in another direction, pretending indifference. She stalked across bridges, ducked around wagons and carts,
that always
jumped out
me
of the way of
their
racing
name.
sedan chairs that wove through the crowds, wished Elaine would say something. Nynaeve knew how to nurse a grudge, and the longer she herself kept silent, the worse it was when she spoke. So the longer Elaine walked without speaking, the darker became the image in her mind of how it was going to be back in their rooms. That made her furious. She had admitted she was wrong, if only to herself. Elaine had no right to make her suffer this way. She began wearing such a face that even people who did not notice their rings gave them a clear path. People who did notice usually seemed to find an urgent need to be a street away. Even some sedan chair bearers skirted around her. How old did Rihanna look to you? Elaine asked suddenly. Nynaeve nearly jumped. They were almost back to Mulhara. 50 years? Maybe 60? I don't see it matters. She ran her eyes over the crowd to see if anyone was close enough to hear. A passing hawker, Her tray, displaying a bitter little yellow fruit called a lemon, tried to swallow her cry in mid-shout when Nynaeve's gaze rested on her for a moment, with the result that she doubled over her tray, coughing and choking. Nynaeve sniffed. The woman probably had been eavesdropping, if not planning to cut a purse. They are a guild, Elaine, and they do know where the bowl is. I just know they do. That was not what she had intended to say at all. If she apologized for dragging Elaine into this now, maybe it would not be so bad. I suppose they are, Elaine said absently. I suppose they might. How is it that she can have aged so? Nynaeve stopped dead in the middle of the street. After all that arguing, after getting them thrown out, she supposed? Well, I suppose she aged the same way as the rest of us, a day at a time. Elaine, if you believed, why did you announce who you were like Rhiannon at the tower? She rather liked that. According to the story, what Queen Rhiannon got was far from what she had wanted. The question did not seem to register with Elaine for all her education. She pulled Nynaeve to one side as a curtained green carriage rumbled past. The street was not very wide there. Over to the front of a seamstress's shop, with a wide doorway showing several dressmakers' forms clothed in half-done dresses. They were not going to tell us anything, Nynaeve, not if you got down on your knees and begged. Nynaeve opened her mouth indignantly, then snapped it shut. She had never said anything about begging. Anyway, why should she have been the only one? Better any woman at all than Matt Coffin. Elaine had a fly up her nose, though, and was not to be distracted. Nynaeve, she must have slowed like everyone else. How old is she to look 50 or 60? What are you talking about? Without thinking, Nynaeve noted the location in a corner of her mind. The seamstress's work looked quite good, worth closer examination. She probably doesn't channel any more than she can help, afraid as she is of being mistaken for a sister. She wouldn't have wanted her face too smooth, after all. You never listened in class, did you? Elaine murmured. She saw the plump seamstress beaming in the doorway and drew Nynaeve toward the corner of the building. Considering the amount of lace the seamstress wore on her own dress, the bodice buried in it, and paces of it drooping over her exposed petticoats, she would bear close watching if Nynaeve did order anything. Forget clothes for one moment, Nynaeve. Who is the oldest accepted you remember? She gave Elaine a very level look. The woman made it sound as if she never thought of anything else. And she had too listened, sometimes. Ellen Worrell, I think. She's about my age, I think. Of course, the seamstress
playing a little bit of UFC 5 right now.
Neckline and much less lace, in green silk. Lan liked green, though she certainly was not going to choose her dresses.
After this, you know what? Before the round 2 starts, let's do another dab.
Coloring fiercely, she tried to explain. She was sure she could. By Beltane, gave her no opportunity for a word. Ellen's sister came to visit her just before you first arrived at the tower, Nanny. Her younger sister. The woman had gray hair. Well, some of it now. She must have been over 40, Nanny. Ellen Wall was past. But what are you saying, Elaine? No one was close enough to listen, and no one seemed to be giving her a second glance, except the still hopeful seamstress. But Elaine lowered her voice to a whisper. We slowly, somewhere between 20 and 25, we begin aging more slowly. How much depends on how strong we are, but when doesn't? Any woman who can channel does it. Takima said she thought it was the beginning of achieving the age.
That was a close round on that
I
one.
don't think anyone has ever reached that until they've worn the shawl at least a year or two, sometimes 5 or more. Think. You know any sister with gray hair is old, even if you aren't supposed to mention it. So if Rhiannon slowed, and she must have, Nynaeve did not care who Rhiannon was. She wanted to cry. No wonder everyone refused to believe her age. It explained why the women circled back home had looked over her shoulder as if unsure she was old enough to be trusted fully. Achieving a sister's age was well, but how long did she have gray hairs? Blinking, she turned away angrily, and something struck her a glancing blow on the back of the head. Staggering, she rounded on Elaine in astonishment. Why had the woman hit her? Only Elaine lay in a heap, eyes closed and a nasty purple lump rising on her temple. Groggily, Nynaeve fell to her knees and gathered her friend into her arms. Your friend must be taken ill, a long-nosed woman said, kneeling beside them, careless of a yellow dress that showed far too much bosom, even by Ebudari standards. Let me help. A tall fellow, handsome in his embroidered silk vest, except for a rather oily grin, bent to take Nynaeve's shoulders. Here, I have a carriage. We'll take you somewhere more comfortable than a paving stone. Go away, Nynaeve told them politely. We don't need your help. The man kept trying to raise her to her feet, though, to guide her toward a red carriage, where a startled-appearing woman in blue beckoned vigorously. The long-nosed woman actually tried to lift Elaine, thanking the man for his help, and chattering how his carriage sounded a fine idea. A crowd of onlookers seemed to have gathered out of air in a semicircle, women murmuring sympathy about fainting from the heat, men offering to help carry the ladies. A scrawny fellow, bold as you please, reached for Nynaeve's purse almost right under her nose. Her head still swam enough to make embracing Saidar difficult, but if all those nattering folk had not fueled her temper, what she saw lying in the street would have. An arrow with a blunt stone head. The one that had raised her, or the one that had struck Elaine. She channeled, and the scrawny cut-purse doubled over, clutching himself and squealing like a pig in briars. Another flow, and the long-nosed woman fell over backward with a shriek twice as high. The man in the silk vest apparently decided they did not need his help after all, because he turned and ran for the carriage, but she gave him a dose anyway. He out-bellowed any outraged bull as the woman in the carriage hauled him in by his vest. Thank you, but we don't need any help, Nynaeve shouted, politely. Few remained to hear. Once it became clear that the one power was being used, and folk suddenly leaping about and yelling for no visible cause made it clear enough to most, they hurried elsewhere. The long-nosed woman gathered herself up and actually jumped onto the back of the red carriage, clinging precariously as the dark-vested driver whipped the horses away through the crowd, people leaping aside. Even the hobbled off as fast as he could. Nynaeve could not have cared less had the earth opened and swallowed the whole.
I won by doctor stoppage.
Aching, she ran fine flows of wind and water, earth, fire, and spirit.
He's getting me though.
Through Elaine.
I thought I was gonna lose.
It was a simple weave, no bother despite her.
Took him down to start laying elbows across his fucking forehead.
The bruise was not serious. The bones of
the doctor had to come in and
broken.
Doctor
Normally,
stopped
she
it.
would have redirected those same.
Give me 1 second, everyone. I'll be right back.
The healing she had discovered herself. At the moment, simpler weaves were all she could manage, though. With just spirit, wind, and water, she wove the healing that Yellows had used since time immemorial. Elaine's eyes shot open wide, and with a gasp that seemed to take all the air in her, she convulsed like a netted trout, slippered heels drumming on the pavement. That only lasted a moment, of course, but in that moment the bruise shrank and vanished. Nynaeve helped her to her feet, and a woman's hand appeared, holding a pewter cup full of water. Even an Aes Sedai might be thirsty after that, the seamstress said. Elaine reached for it, but Nynaeve laid fingers on her wrist. No, thank you. The woman shrugged, and as she turned away, Nynaeve added in a different tone, Thank you. It seemed to come easier the more you said it. She was not sure she liked that. That ocean of lace heaved as the seamstress shrugged again. I make dresses for anyone. I can do better for your coloring than that. She vanished back into her shop. Nynaeve frowned after her. What happened? Elaine demanded. Why wouldn't you let me take a drink? I'm thirsty and hungry. With a last frown for the seamstress, Nynaeve bent to pick up the arrow. The other woman needed no explanations. Saidar shone around her in a flash. Teslin and Jolene? Nynaeve shook her head. The slight wooziness seemed to be fading. She did not think those two would stoop to this. She did not think so. What about Rihanna? She said quietly. The seamstress was back in the doorway, still hopeful. She might want to make sure we leave. Or worse, maybe Garinia. That was almost as chilling as Sarah and twice as infuriating. Somehow Elaine managed to look pretty while scowling. Whoever it was, we will settle them. You'll see. The scowl faded. Nynaeve, if the circle does know where the bowl is, we can find it, but... She bit her lip, hesitating. I only know one way to be sure. Nynaeve nodded slowly, though she would rather have eaten a handful of dirt. Today had seemed so bright for a time, but then it had spiraled into darkness, from Rihanna to... Oh, light. How long before she had her gray hair? Don't cry, Nynaeve. Matt can't possibly be that bad. He'll find it for us in a few days, I know. Nynaeve only cried harder. Chapter 25. Mind Trap. Moghedien did not want to dream the dream again, but wanting to wake, wanting to scream, did no good. Sleep held her faster than any manacles. The beginning went by quickly, a sketchy blur. No mercy. She would have to relive the rest that much sooner. She barely recognized the woman who entered the tent where she was held prisoner. Halima, secretary to one of these fools who called themselves Aes Sedai. Fools, yet they held her tightly enough by the band of silver metal around her neck, held her and made her obey. Fast movement, though she prayed for slowness. The woman channeled to make a light, and Moghedien saw only the light. It had to be Saidin. Among the living, only the chosen knew how to tap the true power, the power that came from the Dark One. And few were fool enough to, except in direst need. But that was impossible. Blurring quickness. The woman named herself Arangar and called Moghedien by name. She gave summons to the pit of doom and removed the Idam necklace, flinching at pain no woman should have felt. Again, how many times had she done this? Again, Moghedien wove a small gateway in the tent. She skimmed to give herself time to think in the endless dark, but no sooner did she step onto her platform, like a small enclosed marble balcony complete with a comfortable chair, than she arrived on the black slopes of Sheol Ghul, forever shrouded in twilight, where vents and tunnels emitted steam and smoke and harsh vapors, and a Myrddraal came to her in its dead black garb, like a slug-white eyeless man, but taller, more massive than any other half-man. It regarded her arrogantly, and gave its odd name unbidden, and commanded her to come. These were not things Myrddraal did with the chosen. Now she screamed in the depths of her mind for the dream to move faster, to blur beyond seeing, beyond knowing. But now, as she followed Shaidar Haran's back into the entrance to the pit of doom, now all flowed at its normal pace, and seemed more real than Tel'aran'rhiod Riyadh or the waking world. Tears leaked from Moghedien's eyes, down cheeks that already glistened. She twitched on her hard pallet, arms and legs jerking as she fought desperately, futilely, to wake. She was no longer aware that she dreamed. All seemed real, but deep memories remained, and in those depths instinct shrieked and clawed for escape. She was well familiar with the sloping tunnels ceilinged in stone daggers like fangs, the walls glowing with pale light. Many times she had made this downward journey since the day so long ago when she first came to make obeisance to the great Lord and pledge her soul, but never as now, never with her failure known in all its magnitude. Always before she had managed to hide failures even from the great Lord. Many times. Things could be done here that could be done nowhere else. Things could happen here that could happen nowhere else. She gave a start as one of the stone fangs brushed her hair, then gathered herself as best she could. Those spikes and blades still cleared the strange, too-tall Myrddraal easily, but though it overtopped her by head and shoulders and more, she was forced to move her head around their points now. Reality was clay to the great Lord here, and he often made his displeasure known so. A stone tooth struck her shoulder, and she ducked to go under another. There was no longer enough height in the tunnel for her to straighten as she walked. She bent lower, scurrying crouched in the Murdrall's wake, trying to get closer. Its stride never changed, but no matter how quickly she scuttled, the interval between them did not lessen. The ceiling descending, the great lord's fangs to rend traitors and fools, and Moghedien dropped to hands and knees, crawling, then flattened to elbows and knees. Light flared and flickered in the tunnel, cast from the entrance to the pit itself just ahead, and Moghedien slithered on her belly, pulled herself along with her hands, pushed with her feet. Stone points dug at her flesh, caught at her dress. Panting, she wriggled the last distance to the sound of ripping wool. Staring back over her shoulder, she shivered convulsively. Where the tunnel mouth should have been stood a smooth stone wall. Perhaps the great lord had timed it all exactly, and perhaps, had she been slower... The ledge on which she lay projected above a black mottled red lake of molten rock, where flames the size of men danced and died and reappeared. Overhead, the cavern rose roofless through the mountain to a sky where wild clouds raced, striated red and yellow and black, as if on the wings of time themselves. It was not the dark clouded sky seen outside on Shale Ghul. None of that earned a second glance, and not just because she had seen it many times. The bore into the great lord's place of imprisonment was no closer here than anywhere else in the world, but here she could feel it. Here she could bathe in the radiant glory of the great lord. The true power washed around her, so strong here that attempting to channel it would fry her to a cinder. Not that she had any desire to pay the price elsewhere either. She started to push up to her knees, and something struck her between the shoulder blades, driving her down hard onto the stone ledge, crushing the air from her lungs. Stunned, she struggled for breath, then stared back up over her shoulder. The Murdral stood with one massive boot planted firmly on her back. Almost she embraced Saidar, though channeling here without express permission was a good way to die. The arrogance on the slopes above was one thing, but this... "Do you know who I am?" she demanded. "I am Moghedien." That eyeless gaze watched her as it might an insect. She'd often seen Murdral look at ordinary humans that way. "Moghedien." That voice inside her head flushed away all thought of the Murdral. It nearly flushed away all thought. Beside this, any human lover's deepest embrace was a drop of water beside the ocean. "How deep is your failure, Moghedien? The chosen are always the strongest, but you let yourself be captured. You taught those who would oppose me, Moghedien." Eyelids fluttering, she fought for coherence. "Great Lord, I taught them only small things, and I fought them as I could. I taught them a supposed way to detect a man channeling." She managed to laugh. "Practicing it gives them such headaches they cannot channel for hours." Silence. Perhaps as well. They'd given up trying to learn that long before her rescue, but the Great Lord did not need to know that. "Great Lord, you know how I have served you. I serve in the shadows, and your enemies never feel my bite until my venom is working." She did not quite dare say she had deliberately let herself be captured to work from within, but she could suggest. "Great Lord, you know how many of your enemies I brought down in the War of Power, from the shadows, unseen, or if seen, ignored, because I could not possibly..."
That match might deserve a
silence. And then,
a dab on that one.
"My children are always the strongest. My hand moves." That voice reverberating in her skull turned her bones to boiling honey and her brain to fire. The Murdral had her chin in its hand, forcing her head up before her vision cleared enough to see the knife in its other hand. All her dreams were to end here in a slit throat, her body going to feed the Trollocs. Perhaps Shaidar Haran would save a choice cut for itself. Perhaps... No. She knew she was going to die, but this Murdral would not eat one shred of her. She reached to embrace Saidar, and her eyes bulged. There was nothing there. Nothing. It was as if she had been severed. She knew she had not. It was said that tearing was the deepest pain anyone could know, beyond any power to deaden. But in those stunned moments, the Myrddraal forced her mouth open, scraped the blade along her tongue, then nicked her ear. And as it straightened with her blood and saliva, she knew, even before it produced what appeared to be a tiny, fragile cage of gold wire and crystal. Some things could only be done here, some only to those who could channel, and she had brought a number of men and women for this very purpose. No, she breathed. Her eyes could not leave the Korsuvra. No, not me. Not me! Ignoring her, Shaidar Haran scraped the fluids from the knife onto the Korsuvra. The crystal turned a milky pink, the first setting. With a flick of its wrist, it tossed the mind trap out over the lake of molten stone for the second. The golden crystal cage arched through the air and suddenly stopped, floating at the very spot where it seemed the boar was, the place where the pattern lay thinnest of all. Moghedien forgot the Myrddraal. She flung out her hands toward the boar. Mercy, great lord! She had never noticed that the great lord of the dark possessed any mercy, but had she been bound in a cell with rabid wolves, or with a Darath in Mult, she would have begged the same. In the right circumstances, you begged even for the impossible. The Korsuvra hung in mid-air, turning slowly, glittering in the light of leaping fires below. I have served you with all my heart, great lord. I beg mercy. I beg mercy. You may serve me still. The voice flung her into ecstasy beyond knowing, but at the same instant the sparkling mind trap suddenly glowed like the sun, and in the midst of rapture she knew pain as if she had been immersed in the fiery lake. They blended and she howled, thrashing like a mad thing, thrashing in endless pain, endless, until after ages, after nothing remained but agony and the memory of agony, the tiny mercy of darkness overwhelmed her. Moghedien stirred on the pallet. Not again, please. She barely recognized the woman who entered the tent where she was held prisoner. Please, she shrieked in the depths of her mind. The woman channeled to make a light, and Moghedien saw only the light. Deep in sleep she quivered, vibrating from head to toe. Please! The woman named herself Arangar, and called Moghedien by name. She gave summons to the pit of doom, and... Wake, woman, said a voice like rotted bone crumbling, and Moghedien's eyes popped open. She almost wished for the dream back. No door or window broke the featureless stone walls of her small prison, and there were no glow bulbs or even lamps, but light came from somewhere. She did not know how many days she had been there, only that tasteless food appeared at irregular intervals, that the single bucket serving for sanitation was emptied at even more irregular times, and soap and a bucket of perfumed water were somehow left for her to clean herself. She was not sure whether that was a mercy or not. The glad thrill at seeing a bucket of water reminded her how far she'd fallen. Shaidar Haran was in the cell with her now. Hurriedly rolling from her pallet, she knelt and put her face to the bare stone floor. She had always done whatever was necessary for survival, and the Myrddraal had been all too glad to teach her what was necessary. I greet you eagerly, Lyakova. The lashed-together title burned on her tongue. One who owns me, it meant, or simply, my owner. The strange shield Shaidar Haran had used on her, Myrddraal could not, but it did. The shield was not in evidence, yet she did not consider channeling. The true power was denied her, of course. That could be drawn only with the Great Lord's blessing. But the source tantalized, though the glow just beyond sight seemed somehow odd. She still did not consider it. Every time the Myrddraal visited, it displayed her mind trap. Channeling too near your own Korsuvra was extremely painful. The nearer, the more the pain. This close, she did not think she would survive a simple touch on the source. And that was the least of the mind trap's dangers. Shaidar Haran chuckled, a rasp of dried, cracked leather. That was another difference about this Myrddraal. Far more cruel than Trollocs, who were merely bloodthirsty, Myrddraal were cold and dispassionate in it. Shaidar Haran often showed amusement, though. So far she felt lucky to have only bruises. Most women would have been on the brink of madness by now, if not beyond. "And are you eager to obey?" that rustling, grating voice asked. "Yes, I am eager to obey, Nyakova," whatever was necessary to survive. But she still gasped when cold fingers suddenly tangled in her hair. She scrambled to her feet on her own as much as possible, but still was hauled up. At least this time her feet remained on the floor. The Myrddraal studied her, expressionless. Remembering past visits, it required an effort not to flinch or scream, or simply reach for Saidar and make an end. "Close your eyes," it told her, "and keep them closed until you are commanded to open them." Moghedien's eyes snapped shut. One of Shaidar Haran's lessons had been instant obedience. Besides, with her eyes closed, she could try to pretend that she was somewhere else. Whatever was necessary. Abruptly, the hand in her hair rushed her forward, and she screamed in spite of herself. The Myrddraal meant to run her into the wall. Her hands went up for protection, and Shaidar Haran released her. She staggered at least 10 steps, but her cell was not 10 paces corner to corner. Wood smoke. She smelled a faint touch of wood smoke. She kept her eyelids firmly closed, though. She meant to continue with no more than bruises, and as few bruises as possible for as long as she could manage. "You can look now," a deep voice said. She did, cautiously. The speaker was a tall, broad-shouldered young man in black boots and breeches and a flowing white shirt unlaced at the top, who watched her with startlingly blue eyes from a deep, cushioned armchair in front of a marble fireplace, where flames danced along long logs. She stood in a wood-paneled room that might have belonged to a wealthy merchant or noble of moderate rank in this time, the furniture lightly carved and touched with gilt, the rugs woven in red and gold arabesques. She did not doubt it was somewhere close by Sheol Ghul, though. It did not have the feel of Telaran Riod, the only other possibility. Swiveling her head hastily, she drew a deep breath. The Myrddraal was nowhere to be seen. Tight bands of quandary seemed to vanish from around her chest. "Did you enjoy your time in the vacuole?" Moghedien felt icy fingers dig into her scalp. She was no researcher or maker, but she knew that word. She did not even think to ask how a young man of this time did, too. Sometimes there were bubbles in the pattern, though someone like Masana would say that was too simple an explanation. Vacuoles could be entered if you knew how, and manipulated much like the rest of the world. Researchers had often done great experiments in vacuoles, so she vaguely remembered hearing. But they were outside the pattern, really, and sometimes they closed up, or perhaps broke off and drifted away. Even Masana could not say what happened, except that anything in them at the time was gone forever. "How long?" She was surprised her voice was so steady. She rounded on the young man who sat there showing her white teeth. "I said how long? Or don't you know?" "I saw you arrive." He paused, lifting a silver goblet from the table beside his chair, eyes smiling at her over the rim as he drank. "The night before last." She could not hide a relieved gasp. The only reason anyone would want to enter a vacuole was that time flowed differently there, sometimes slower, sometimes faster, sometimes much faster. She would not have been entirely surprised to learn that the Great Lord had really imprisoned her for 100 years, or 1,000, to emerge into a world already his, to make her way feeding among carrion, while the other chosen stood at the pinnacle. She was still one of the chosen, in her own mind at least, until the Great Lord himself said she was not. She had never heard of anyone being released once a mind trap was set. She would find a way. There was a way for those who were cautious, who called caution cowardice. She herself had carried a few of that so-called brave sort to Shale Ghul to be fitted with Korsuvra. Suddenly it occurred to her that this fellow knew a great deal for a friend of the dark, especially one not many years past 20. He swung one leg over an arm of lounging insolently under her scrutiny. Grendal might have snatched him, if he had any position or power. Only too strong a chin kept him from being pretty enough. She did not think she had ever seen eyes so blue. With his insolence in her very face and what she had had to endure at Shaidar Haran's hands so fresh, with the source calling her and the Myrddraal gone, she considered teaching this young friend of the dark a sharp lesson. The fact that her clothes were grimy added their part. She herself smelled faintly of the perfume in the wash-water, but she had had no way to clean the rough woolen dress in which she fled Egwene Alvir, with its rips from her journey down to the pit. Prudence prevailed. This room must be close to Shale Ghul, but barely. "What is your name?" she demanded. "Do you have any idea who you are speaking to?" "Yes, I do, Moghedien. You may call me Moradin." Moghedien gasped. Not for the name, any fool could call himself Death, but a tiny black fleck, just large enough to see, floated straight across one of those blue eyes and then across the other in the same line. This Moradin had tapped into the true power, and more than once, much more. She knew that some men who could channel survived in this time aside from Althor. This fellow was much of a size with Althor, but she had not expected the great lord to allow one that particular honor. An honor with a bite, as any of the chosen knew. In the long run, the true power was far more addictive than the one power. A strong will could hold down the desire to draw more saidar or saidin, but she herself did not believe the will existed strong enough to resist the true power, not once the Sa appeared in your eyes. The final price was different, but no less terrible. "You have been given distinction greater than you know," she told him. As though her filthy dress was the finest strife, she took the armchair opposite him. "Bring me some of that wine, and I will tell you. Only 29 others have ever been granted." To her shock, he laughed. "You misapprehend, Moghedien. You still serve the great lord, quite as you once did. The time for playing your own games has passed. If you had not managed to do some good by accident, you would be dead now." "I am one of the chosen, boy," she said, fury burning through caution. She sat up straight, facing him with all the knowledge of an age that made his little different from times of mudcuts. As much of that knowledge as she had, anyway, and in some areas concerning the one power, no one outstripped her. She almost embraced the source, no matter how close Shale Ghul lay. "Your mother probably used my name to frighten you not so many years gone, but know that grown men who could crumple you like a rag sweated when they heard it. You will watch your tongue with me." He reached into the open neck of his shirt, and her own tongue clove to the roof of her mouth, her eyes fixed on the small cage of gold wire and blood-red crystal that he drew out, dangling on a cord. She thought vaguely that he tucked another just like it back in, but she had eyes only for her own. It definitely was hers. His thumb stroked, and she felt that caress across her mind, her soul. Breaking a mind trap did not require much more pressure than he was using. She could be on the other side of the world or farther, and it would not matter a hair. The part of her that was her would be separated. She would still see with her eyes and hear with her ears, taste what crossed her tongue and feel what touched her, but helpless within an automaton that was utterly obedient to the Korsuvra. Further than not there was any way to get free of it. A mind trap was just as implied. She could feel the blood draining from her face. "You understand now?" he said. "You still serve the great lord, but now it will be by doing as I say." "I understand, Miakova," she said automatically. Again he laughed, a deep, rich sound that mocked her as he put the mind trap away beneath his shirt. "There is no need for that. Now you've had your lesson. I will call you Moghedien, and you will call me Moradin. You are still one of the chosen. Who is there to replace you? Yes, of course, Moradin, she said tonelessly. Whatever he said, she knew that she was owned. Chapter 26. The Irrevocable Words. Morgheze lay awake, staring at the ceiling through the moonlit darkness, and tried to think of her daughter. A single pale linen sheet covered her, but despite the heat, she sweated in a woolen sleeping gown, laced tightly to the neck. Sweat hardly mattered. No matter how many times she bathed, no matter how hot the water, she did not feel clean. Elaine must be safe in the White Tower. At times it seemed years since she could make herself trust Aes Sedai. Yet whatever the paradox, the tower was surely the safest place for Elaine. She tried to think of Gawain. He would be in Tar Valon with his sister, full of his pride for her, so earnest in his desire to be her shield when she needed one. And of Galad. Why would they not let her see him? She loved him as much as if he had come out of her own body, and in so many ways he needed it more than the other two. She tried to think of them. It was difficult to think of anything except wide eyes stared up into the darkness, glistening with unshed tears. She'd always thought she was brave enough to do whatever needed doing, to face whatever came. She'd always believed she could pick herself up and continue to fight. In one endless hour, without leaving more than a few bruises that were already fading, Radam Asunawa had begun teaching her differently. Eamon Valda had completed her education with one question. The bruise her answer had left on her heart had not faded. She should have gone back to Asunawa herself and told him to do his worst. She prayed that Elaine was safe. Perhaps it was not fair to hope more for Elaine than for Galad or Gawain, but Elaine would be the next Queen of Andor. The Tower would not miss the chance to put an Aes Sedai on the Lion Throne. If only she could see Elaine, see all her children once more. Something rustled in the dark bedchamber, and she held her breath, fought against trembling. The faint moonlight barely let her make out the bedposts. Valda had ridden north from Amador yesterday, him and Asunawa, with thousands of white cloaks to face the Prophet. But if he had come back, a shape in the darkness resolved into a woman, too short for Lini. I thought you might still be awake, Brianna's voice said softly. Drink this. It will help. The Kyrianan woman tried to put a silvery cup into Morgheze's hand. It gave off a slightly sour smell. Wait until you're summoned to bring me drink, she snapped, pushing the cup away. Warm liquid spilled onto her hand, onto the linen sheet. I was almost asleep when you came stamping in, she said. Leave me. Instead of obeying, the woman stood looking down at her, face shadowed. Morgheze did not like Brianna Tamborwin. Whether Brianna truly was nobly born and come down in the world, as she sometimes claimed, or merely a servant who had learned to counterfeit her betters, she obeyed when and as she chose, and let her tongue run entirely too free, as she proved now. You moan like a sheep, and even kept low, her voice seethed in anger. She set the cup on the small bedside table with a thump. More of the contents splashed onto the table.
No, before I light this up, let's do another dab.
Far worse. You are alive. None of your bones are broken. Your wits are whole. Endure. Let the past pass and go on with your life. You have been so much on edge that the men walk on.
Hey, 17 is oil. How you doing, bro?
Lamgwin has hardly slept.
Cheers to you, too.
Morgheze flushed with annoyance. Even in Andor, she caught the woman's arm in a tight grip, but her anxiety roared with displeasure. They don't know what you did. If they did, they would try to avenge her.
Well, I'm about to. Should I heat up?
Lini and I draped a linen over their eyes for you, Brianna sneered, pulling her hand away and flinging it back at her. If I could save Lamgwin, I would let them.
Hell yeah. Well, I'm not doing too bad. I guess I can't complain too much.
I see a woman without the courage to accept the day. I will not let you destroy him with your cowardice. Cowardice. Outrage welled up in Morgaze, yet no words came. Her fingers knotted in the sheet. She did not think she could have decided in cold blood to lie with Valda, but had she could have lived with it. She thought she could. Another matter entirely to say yes because she feared facing Asuna with swords and needles again. Feared worse eventually. She had screamed under Asunawa's ministrations. Valda was the one who had showed her the true borders of her courage, so far short of Valda's touch. His bed could be forgotten with time, but she would never be able to wash the shame of that.
I'm gonna heat that up again. First, I'm taking a drink.
The truth in her face, and she did not know how to reply. She was spared the need by a rush of boots in the outer room. The bedchamber door flung open, and a running man stopped a pace inside. So you're awake. Good, Talonvor's voice said after a moment, which allowed her heart to start beating again, allowed her to breathe. She tried to release Brianna. She did not remember clasping it, but she was surprised the woman squeezed once before letting go. Something is happening, striding to the lone window. Standing to one side as if to avoid being seen, he peered into the night. Moonlight outlined his tall form. Master Gil, come and tell what you saw. A head appeared in the doorway, bald top shining in the darkness. In the other room, a hulking shadow moved past Lamgwin door. When Basil Gil realized she was still in bed, that faint shining of his scalp jerked as he directed his eyes elsewhere, though he probably had difficulty making out more than the bed itself. Master Gil was even wider than Lamgwin, but not nearly as tall. Forgive me. I didn't mean to. He cleared his throat violently, and his boots scraped on the floor, shifting. Had he had a cap, he would have been turning it in his hands, or waddling along the corridor on my way to Jake's, was what he could not bring himself to say to her. Anyway, I glanced out one of the windows, and I saw a big bird, I think, land on top of the South Barracks. A bird? Linny's thin voice drove Master Gil to leap into the room, clearing the doorway. Or maybe it was a sharp poke in his stout ribs. Linny usually took every advantage her gray hair offered. She stalked, belting her nightrobe. Fools! Ox-brained lummoxes! You woke my She stopped with a fierce cough. Linny never forgot that she had been Morgaze's nurse, and her mother's as well, but she never slipped in front of others. She would be cross that she had now. Bird? Patting her hairnet, she automatically tucked in a few strands that had escaped in her sleep. Have you been drinking, Basil Gil? Morgaze wondered that herself. I didn't know it was a bird, Master Gil protested. It didn't matter. What else flies except it was big. Men climbed off its back, and there was another still on its neck. While I was slapping my face to wake up, another of the things landed, and more men climbed down. And then another came, and I decided it was time to tell Lord Talonvor. Linny did not sniff, but Morgaze could almost feel her stare, and it was not directed at her. The man who had abandoned his inn to follow her certainly felt it. The light's own truth, my queen, he insisted. Light, Talonvor announced like an echo. Something just landed atop the North Barracks. Morgaze had never heard him sound shaken before. All she wanted was to make them all go away and leave her alone in her misery, but there seemed no hope. Talonvor was worse than Brianna in many ways, much worse. My robe, she said, and for once Brianna was quick to hand her one. Master Gil hastily turned his face to the wall, while she climbed from the bed and put on the silk robe. She strode to the window, tying the sash. The long north barracks loomed across the wide courtyard, 4 hulking floors of flat-roofed dark stone. Not a light showed. There was all was stillness and silence. "I see nothing, Talonvor." He drew her back. He said. Another time she would have regretted his hand leaving her shoulder and been irritated at her own regret as well as his tone. Now, after Valda, she felt relief, and irritation at the relief as well as his tone. He was too disrespectful by miles, far too stubborn, too young, not much older than Galad. Shadows moved as the moon did, but nothing else stirred. Off in the city of Amador, a dog bayed, answered by more. Then, as she opened her mouth to dismiss Talonvor and all of them, darkness atop the massive barracks pumped up and hurled itself off the roof. Something, Talonvor had called it, and she had no better name. An impression of a long body that seemed thicker than a man was tall, great ribbed wings like a bat's sweeping down as the creature fell toward the courtyard. A figure, a man, sitting just behind a sinuous neck. And then the wings caught air, and the something soared up, blocking the moonlight as it swept over her head, trailing a long, thin tail. Morghese closed her mouth slowly. The only thought that came to her was shadow spawn. Trollocs and Myrddraal were not the only shadow-twisted creatures in the Blight. She had never been taught of anything like this, but her tutors in the tower said that things lived there no one had ever seen clearly and lived to describe. How could it be so far south, though? Abruptly, a flash of light flared with a great boom in the direction of the main gates, and then again at 2 more places along the great outer wall. Those were gates, too, she believed. What in the pit of doom was that? Talonvor muttered in a moment of silence before alarm gongs began resounding in the darkness. Shouts rose, and screams, and hoarse cries like some sort of horn. Fire leaped with a crash of thunder, then again elsewhere. The one power, Morghese breathed. She might not be able to channel, or as well as not, but notions of shadow spawn fled. It must be Aes Sedai. She heard someone's breath catch behind her, Lyney or Brianna. Basil Gill excitedly murmured, "Aes Sedai," and Lam back too low for her to understand. Off in the darkness, metal clashed on metal, fire bellowed, and lightning streaked from the cloudless sky. Faintly through the din came alarm bells from the city at last, but strangely few. Aes Sedai? Talonvor sounded doubtful. Why now? To rescue you, Morghese? I thought they couldn't use the power against men, only shadow spawn. Besides, if that winged creature wasn't shadow spawn, I will never see one. You don't know what you are talking about, she said, confronting him heatedly. A crossbow bolt clashed against the window frame in a spray of stone chips. Air stirred against her face as it ricocheted between them and planted itself in one of the bedposts with a solid chunk. A few inches to the right, and all her troubles would have been ended. She did not move, but Talonvor pulled her away from the window with an oath. Even by moonlight she could see his frown as he studied her. For a moment she thought he might touch her face. If he did, she did not know whether she would weep or scream or order him to leave her forever, or... Instead, he said, "More likely it's some of those men, those shaman or whatever they call themselves." He insisted on accepting the strange, impossible tales that had seeped even into the fortress. "I think I can get you out right now. Everything will be confusion. Come with me." She did not correct him. Few people knew anything about the One Power, much less the differences between saidar and saidin. His idea had its attractions. They might be able to escape in the bedlam of a battle. "Take her out into that?" Lyney screeched. Flaring lights drowned the moon at the window. Crashes and thunders drowned the din of men and swords. "I thought you had more wits, Martin Talonvor." Only fools kiss hornets or bite fire. You heard her say it's Aes Sedai. Do you think she doesn't know? Do you? My lord, if it is Aes Sedai... Master Gil trailed off. Talonvor's hand fell away from her, and he grumbled under his breath. He had a sword. Pedro Nile had allowed him to keep his blade. Eamon Valda was not so trusting. For an instant, disappointment swelled in her breast. If only he had insisted, had dragged her. What's the matter with her? Had he tried to drag her anywhere for any reason, she would have had his hide. She needed to take hold of herself. Valda had dented her confidence. No, he had casually ripped it to shreds, but she must cling to those shreds and knit them up again, somehow, if the tatters were worth knitting up again. At least I can find out what is happening, Talonvor growled, striding for the door. If it is to die, no, you will remain here, please. She was very glad of the pale darkness, hiding her furiously flushing face. She would have bitten her tongue off before saying that last word, but it had slipped out before she knew. She went on in firmer tones. You will remain here, guarding your queen as you should. In the dim light she could see his face, and his bow seemed quite proper, but she would have wagered her last copper both were angry. I will be in your anteroom. Well, there was no doubt about his voice. For once, though, she cared neither how angry he was nor how little he hid it. Very possibly she might kill the infuriating man with her own hands, but he was not going to die tonight, cut down by soldiers, with no way to tell which side he was on. There was no hope of sleep now, even had she been able. Without lighting any lamps, she washed her face and teeth. Brianna and Lini helped her dress, in blue silk slashed with green, with spills of snowy lace at her wrists and beneath her chin. It would do very well for receiving Aes Sedai. Saidar raged in the night. They had to be Aes Sedai. Who else could it be? When she joined the men in the anteroom, they were sitting in bed except for the moonlight through the windows and the occasional flash of power-wrought fire. Even a candle might attract unwanted attention. Lamgwyn and Master Gil sprang from their chairs respectfully. Talonvor stood more slowly, and she needed no light to know he regarded her with a sullen frown. Furious that she had to ignore him, she was his queen. Furious and barely able to keep it from her voice, she ordered Lamgwyn to bring more of the tall wooden chairs further from the windows. In silence they sat and waited, at least silence on their part. Outside, thunderous crashes and roars still echoed. Horns cried and men shouted, and through it she felt Saidar surge and fall and surge again. Slowly, after at least an hour, the battle dwindled and died. Voices still shouted incomprehensible orders, wounded screamed, and sometimes those strange hoarse horns gave voice, but no more did steel ring on steel. Saidar faded. She was sure women still held it inside the fortress, but she did not think any channeled now. All seemed close to peaceful after the clamor and commotion. Talonvor stirred, but she waved him back before he could rise. For a moment she thought he would not obey. Weakened, and sunlight crept in through the windows, shining on Talonvor's glower. She held her hands still in her lap. Patience was but one of the virtues that young man needed to learn. Patience stood second only to courage as a noble virtue. The sun rose higher. Lini and Brianna began whispering together in increasingly worried tones, shooting glances in her direction. Talonvor scowled, dark eyes smoldering, sitting rigid in that dark blue coat that fit him so well. Master Gil fidgeted, running first one hand, then the other across his gray-fringed head, mopping his pink cheeks with a handkerchief. Lamgwyn slouched in his chair, the one-time street tough's heavy-lidded eyes making him seem half asleep. But whenever he glanced at Brianna, a smile flickered on his scarred, broken-nosed face. Morgaze focused on her breathing, almost like the exercises she had done during her months in the tower. patience. If someone did not come soon, she was going to have sharp words to say, Aes Sedai or not. Despite herself, she jumped at an abrupt pounding on the door to the hallway. Before she could tell Brianna to see who was there, the door swung open, banging against the wall. Morghese stared at who entered. A tall, dark, hook-nosed man stared back at her coldly, the long hilt of a sword rising above his shoulder. Strange armor covered his chest, overlapping plates lacquered glistening gold and black, and he held a helmet on his head that looked like an insect's head, black and gold and green, with 3 long, thin green plumes. 2 more armored like him came at his heels, wearing their helmets, though without plumes. Their armor seemed painted rather than lacquered, and they carried crossbows ready. Still more stood in the hall outside, with gold and black tasseled spears. Talonvor and Lamgwin and even stout Master Gil scrambled to their feet, placing themselves between her and her peculiar visitors. She had to push a way through. The hook-nosed man's eyes went straight to her before she could demand an explanation. You are Morghese, Queen of Andor. His voice was harsh, and he drawled his words so badly she barely understood. He stepped on her reply. You will come with me, alone, he added, as Talonvor and Lamgwin and Master Gil all moved forward. The crossbow men presented their weapons. The heavy quarrels looked made to punch holes in armor. A man would hardly slow one down. I have no objection to my people remaining here until I return, she said a good deal more calmly than she felt. Who were these people? She was familiar with the accents of every nation, familiar with their armor. I am sure you will see to my safety very well, Captain. He did not supply a name, only motioned curtly for her to follow. To her vast relief, Talonvor made no fuss, despite his hot gaze. To her vast irritation, Master Gil and Lamgwin looked to him before stepping back. In the hallway, the soldiers formed around her, the hook-nosed officer and the 2 crossbow men in the lead. A guard of honor, she tried to tell herself. This soon after a battle, wandering around unprotected was worse than foolish. There might be holdouts who would seize a hostage or kill any who saw them. She wished she believed that. She tried questioning the officer, but he never spoke a word, never slackened his stride or turned his head, and she stopped trying. None of the soldiers so much as glanced at her. They were hard-eyed men of the kind she knew from her own Queen's guards, men who had seen fighting before, more than once. But who were they? Their boots struck the floor stones as one in an ominous drumbeat emphasized by the stark fortress corridors. There was little color, nothing for beauty except scattered tapestries showing white cloaks in bloody battle. She realized they were taking her toward the Lord Captain Commander's quarters, and a queasiness settled in the pit of her stomach. She had grown almost pleasantly accustomed to the way while Pedro Nile lived. She had come to dread it in the few days since he died. But as they rounded a corner, she started at the sight of some 24 archers marching behind their own officer. Men in baggy trousers and boiled leather breastplates, painted in horizontal stripes of blue and black. Each man wore a conical steel cap, with a veil of gray steel mail covering his face to the eyes. Here and there the ends of mustaches dangled below the veils. The archer's officer bowed to the one leading her guard, who merely raised his hand in reply. Taraboners. She had not seen a Tarabonner soldier in a good many years, but those men were Taraboners in spite of those stripes, or she would eat her slippers. Yet that made no sense. Tarabon was chaos come to life, a 100-sided civil war between pretenders to the throne and Dragonsworn. Tarabon could never have launched this attack on Amador itself, unless, incredibly, one claimant had won out over the rest, and over the Dragonsworn, and it was impossible. And it did not explain these strangely armored soldiers, or that winged beast, or... She thought she had seen strangeness. She thought she had known queasiness. Then she and her guard turned another corner and encountered 2 women. One was slender, short as any Tyrianan and darker than any Tyran, in a blue dress that stopped well short of her ankles. Silver lightning forked across red paras on her breast and the sides of her wide divided skirts. The other woman, in drab dark gray, stood taller than most men, with golden hair to her shoulders that had been brushed till it glistened, and frightened.
All right, everyone. I'm gonna call Anthony's life for tonight. I'll probably be getting on again tomorrow night. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who keeps stopping by. Definitely appreciate all y'all support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.